Good evening. I'm Dave Rainwater. Tonight we'd like to invite you all to go back in time to the old Wild West. You know, we all remember Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer when we were growing up, and the life that we kind of could identify with when America was was still innocent, and you could dangle your feet in the river and put your fishing pole in the line, watch that bobber floating down, and wear your old straw hat. And my connection to Mr. Twain, when I read this line that he wrote in his later years, he said, "I count the man who could fiddle all night in one of those Virginia reels and not lose his grip on the bow is a man that could be counted on in any occasion." Thank you, Mr. Twain. Kudos to the fiddler. And I started reading more about Mr. Twain, and I was fascinated. He loved fiddling. There's references he makes throughout his time in the West. When he got to Virginia City in 1861, and he attended dances, and they used to have a dance called the Virginia Reel. Why, the Virginia Reel was a dance where the ladies line up on one side and the men on the other, and they bow, and then they commence to going through the steps of the dance. And the fiddler, it wasn't just one tune. He'd had to play several tunes for the evening, depending on how many couples there were and the different stages of the dance. So I'd like to recreate some of that for you. Just to get started, I want to get warmed up and do some of the tunes that you would hear during the old territory of Nevada before it was a state. It was the Wild West. And of course, the Civil War had broke out in 1861. It was a time that was politically charged. People were extremely divided and emotional about their politics, like it is today. But the fiddler, if he didn't want to get shot, he would play tunes that would please some of the folks running around of the Southern persuasion and some of the Northern. He might start off with the old Bonnie Blue Flag of Texas. Of course, the fellas in the corner from the north are getting a little frowns on their face. You might play something for them, the old Year of Jubilo. Back to the south. Well, you got to go back north again. Down in Texas, they knew a schottisch called the Texas schottisch. Keeping them Northerners happy with the old rally round the flag. By this time in the dance, everybody's getting along pretty good, and the fiddler might play some sweet tune of an old cowboy Varsuviana called Put Your Little Foot. And then you might end the dance with an old cowboy polka called the heel and toe polka. Then the fiddler, thank you, the fiddler didn't get shot. You know, folks, the story of the West, contrary to what we are led to believe at times, was not always told by cowboys on horseback, spouting off flowery poetry and shooting 44s, or by some dime store novelist in New York City trying to describe what was going on out here, but by daring writers, journalists, newspapermen. And none told it better than Mr. Mark Twain.
Why, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
You know, I have been thinking. It is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the good prudence to never practice either one of them. You know, I don't recollect how I got here this evening. When I was young, why, I could remember anything, whether it happened or not. My faculties have been deteriorating lately, and soon I shall only be able to remember them things which never happened. Well, it has been a long time. Besides, I think we never become really and genuinely our entire and honest selves until we are dead. And not then, but until we have been dead for years and years. I think people ought to start out dead. That way they would be honest so much sooner. Starting out. It all started in the year 1835, Florida, Missouri. I grew up on the west bank of the Mississippi River in a small town named Hannibal. My comrades and I in that small town, we had but one permanent ambition. That was to become a steamboatman. We had other ambitions, but they were transient in nature. You know, when a circus came to town, it all left us suffering to run away and become clowns. And when a minstrel show came to town, why, it left us hankering for that kind of life. And we believed that, well, if we were good and if we lived, God would permit us to become pirates. Well, each one of those ambitions faded in its turn, but the one remaining was to become a steamboatman. After 1 or 2 years serving as a printer's apprentice with my brother Orion, I finally got my opportunity to learn and become a steamboat pilot, a riverboat pilot on the mighty Mississippi, where you had to steer by the shape of the river. You had to learn to read that river like a book. Every bend, every turn, every sandbar, every snag and ripple in that water were more pages making up more chapters in a never-ending, ever-changing book. Why, it was literature of the most serious nature. You had to read it right. Your life depended on it. So did the passengers. Oh, the Mississippi River. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to know the shape of that river, you take an apple and a knife and you peel it all the way around, and when you're done, you take that apple peeling and throw it over your right shoulder. Now, the way it hits the ground is the shape of that river. Oh, the Mississippi River, it is crooked. The banks of the Mississippi are always trying to straighten themselves out. They can never do it. They just stay crooked. You know, I believe that the banks of the Mississippi are the crookedest thing on the face of this earth, except for maybe one other, the banks of America. Yes, indeed. I love that profession more than any other. I expected to end my days on the river. And when my end came, I would die at the wheel. But by and by, there was trouble amongst the states. And in the year 1861, why, the Civil War broke out. Well, commerce on the river ceased. I was out of a show. I had no job. I wasn't sure what to do. You see, Missouri was a divided state. Families were divided too. My mother, she supported the Confederacy. My brother Orion, he supported the Union. Confederacy, the Union. Oh, I joined the Confederate Marion Rangers. I served for 2 weeks, after which I promptly deserted prior to battle. After that, why, the Confederacy fell. Well, you see, I had to quit military service. I had to do it. I had to do it in order to save all the lives of them Union soldiers. Well, they were running themselves to death trying to catch us. We spent 2 weeks retreating, and it was well done. While the Union Army could do no advancing, which was equal to it. Well, right about that time, reports started coming in to St. Joseph, Missouri. Discoveries of gold, silver, rich veins of gold, and pure silver. Why, we were all suffering to head out west and strike it rich. In August of that year, my brother Orion and I, we decided to light out for the territory ahead of the rest. We took passage by overland stage bound for Carson City. With a crack of the driver's whip, we were off. We crossed the Platte River, the Great Plains and the Prairie. We traversed the towering Rockies. We spanned that vast, lonely desert of the Great Basin. I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the scenery was delicious. Air intoxicating. Suppers around a campfire in the evening, mighty enchanting. You know, sometimes we would stack the mail bags up inside the coach, take a nap there, and we would sleep like children. Other times, we'd get up on top, smoke our pipes. The entire landscape opened up before us like an immense picture book filled with magnificence and grandeur. After traveling 1,900 miles by overland stage, we arrived in Carson City, a small town on the Grow, nestled at the toe of the slope of the mighty eastern Sierra Nevada. That territory in Nevada, ladies and gentlemen, it was fabulously rich in gold, silver, copper, tarantulas, rattlesnakes, scorpions, centipedes, desperados, murderers, scallywags, poets, preachers, and jackass rabbits. Now, if you want to see a jackrabbit demonstrate his skills, you must encourage him with a Colt revolver. 1 or 2 shots, and he will stretch out like a yardstick and run from here to San Francisco. You know, it never rained there either. When birds fly over that territory, they have to carry their own provisions with them. Yeah, it is true. I came out west by overland stage. Yes, indeed. You see, I had to come out by stage. That is because the Transcontinental Railroad was not built yet. It did not get built until the year 1869. Now, had it been built, I'd have come out by rail. You know, rail is the safest form of travel. Why, it is safer than riding a horse. It is safer than walking. Much is made of railway accidents in local newspapers. But ladies and gentlemen, you know it is a known fact most people die in bed. While the bedrooms are safe. Almost. Yes, indeed. The railroads are safe, but I believe it is those bedrooms you got to watch out for. Well, that was fine by me because I was about ready to get supplied up and head out to the gold fields of Aurora, Bodie, and Unionville.
You might recognize that tune. One of the very earliest of all the cowboy songs that we know of, "Oh, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie." Beautiful song, was in so many of the old westerns that we remember growing up watching. It was a theme song many times, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sad song. It was first known as a poem published in 1850 called "The Ocean Burial." Actually, it went, "Oh, bury me not in the deep, deep sea, where the rolling waves may roll over me." And then somebody rewrote the words to it, and "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie." Got so bad, though, by 1885, they say that even the horses, it was so overdone and so people were tired of it, the horses were nickering at it and the coyotes were howling. And they would throw you in the creek, your other companions there, cowboys sitting around the old campfire. And Mark Twain came out by stagecoach, and there was no trains out west at the time. And by the way, today is the anniversary, May 10th, of the promontory when the Transcontinental Railroad was finally united, and we had rail travel, but Mark Twain came out by stagecoach. And throughout the West, there were many stage stops. That's how you traveled. People would describe the travel, sometimes 12 or 15 people crammed into one stage and all that baggage. Mr. Twain gave us a funny account in his book, Roughing It. And Roughing It is kind of a travel log of his adventures out west. Anyway, I found it interesting. I started studying, and I found some rules that had been posted on one of the hotels out west here. If you were going to travel by stagecoach, you had to abide by the rules. And number one, there's about 9 of them here. It says, abstinence from liquor is requested, but if you must drink, pass it around. A man who drinks by himself in such a case is lost to all human feeling. Number 2, don't swear, don't snore, nor lop over on your neighbor while sleeping. Number 3, buffalo robes are provided for your comfort during cold weather. Hogging the robes will not be tolerated, and the offender will be made to ride with the driver. Number 4, gentlemen must refrain from the use of rough language while in the presence of ladies and children. Number 5, in the event of runaway horses, remain calm. Leaping from the coach in panic will leave you injured and at the mercy of the elements, hostile Indians, and hungry wolves. Number 6 is, if the ladies are present, gentlemen are urged to forego smoking cigars and pipes, as the odor of the same is repugnant to the gentle sex. Chewing tobacco is permitted, but spit with the wind, not against it. Number 7, never point out places along the route where horrible murders have been committed. Number 8, never attempt to fire a gun or pistol while on the road. It may frighten the horses, and the careless handling and cocking of the weapon makes people nervous. Number 9, don't discuss politics or religion, particularly important when a gun is present.
Well, I was almost supplied up. There was just one more thing I needed to do. I did something that most relatives are known to do now and then. I borrowed as much money as I could from my brother Orion. I needed a grub stake. I bought plenty of hardtack, coffee, sugar, bacon, beans. Oh, plenty of that Comstock sarsaparilla. Oh, yes. I was almost supplied up and ready to head out for the gold fields of Aurora, Bodie, and Unionville. But you know, there was just one more thing. I figured I should have a horse to ride. You see, everybody in that town rode a horse. I had never seen such magnificent horsemanship as that displayed every day on the streets of Carson by those Mexican vaqueros and Californios. My, how they rode. Nonchalant in the saddle, just slightly out of the perpendicular, broad hat brim blowed square up in the front, and a long riata swinging overhead, while they swept through that town like the wind. Next minute, they were a sailing puff of dust off on the far, far sagebrush desert. Oh, how I envied them. I was determined to have a horse. You see, I had been a riverboat pilot, and I just recently learned the difference between a cow and a horse. I was anxious to learn more about it. Right about that time, an auctioneer comes into the plaza, dragging behind him a creature with as many bumps and corners on him as a dromedary camel, and twice as ugly. But he was going for $25 and a half, gentlemen, for the horse, saddle, and the bridle. Well, right at that moment, a man who I did not know, but who later turned out to be the auctioneer's brother, noticed the wistful look in my eye. He observed to me, "Now that there is a mighty fine horse for the price. Why, the saddle alone is worth that money." It was a Spanish saddle. He went on to say, "I know that horse. I know him very well indeed. And I take it that you are a stranger to these here parts. And you may very well think that he is an American horse. But I assure you, he is no such thing of the kind. He is, without the shadow of a doubt, a genuine Mexican plug. That's what he is." Well, I had never heard of a Mexican plug before. But there was something about that man's way of saying it that made me want to spend the last dollars in my pocket on that horse. I asked him, "Does he have any other points about him?" Well, the stranger put his thumb in the pocket of my shirt, and he led me over to one side, and he breathed these words in my ear. "He can out-buck any horse in the entire Nevada Territory." Do say. He can out-buck any horse in America. Do tell. He can out-buck any horse in the world. Well, inwardly, I had already made up my mind I should have a genuine Mexican plug or die. Well, right about that moment, why, the auctioneer yells out, 27 in silver coin. Sold. I gladly paid my money for that horse. I proudly led him on over to the livery so as he could dine out and rest himself up for a while. Later that afternoon, I brought him back into the plaza, where certain helpful citizens held him by the head, while others held him down to earth by the tail. I decided to board that horse along the starboard side. As soon as I was mounted, they let go. He put all of his feet in one bunch together. Then he let his back sway down, like pulling back the spring of a mighty bow. Then he let go with a sudden arch. It shot me about a mile straight up in the air like an arrow. Well, I wasn't used to such things. I came straight back down, right back down in the saddle. He sent me up a second time. Next I landed astride his neck, grabbed hold of the hair and hung on. Then he decided to walk around in his hind legs for a while like a congressman. Well, I slipped back down his neck, hit the pommel, did a somersault, and landed straight back in the saddle. Then he decided to go the other way. He walked around in his hands for a while like a schoolboy, all the while kicking at the sky with his hind feet. Well, he put all four back together a third time and sent me up again. Just as I was leaving the saddle, I heard somebody say, "Don't he buck though?" So that was bucking. I was very glad to know about it. Not that I was enjoying it, you understand, but I had taken a certain interest in it. Glad to know the name of it. Right at that moment, somebody gave that horse a thwack with a leather strap. And when I came back down, why, the genuine was gone. He was gone clean out of the territory. He darted away like a telegram. He flew over 3 barbed wire fences like a bird. He jumped over a stack of telegraph poles the size of the Presbyterian Church in Virginia City. He ran all the way down 6 Mile Canyon and halfway to Dayton, Nevada. Well, I was all stove up, broke up, and all gone to pieces. I put one hand on my head, the other on my stomach. If I'd had 16 hands, I'd have had a place for every one of them. I didn't ride that horse no more after that. I just loaned him out to folks that might be needing exercise. Everybody I loaned him to got plenty of exercise. One time I loaned him to a county clerk. He ended up dragging that horse back behind the wagon back to town. You know, later, I tried to sell him, but no one was buying. Folks said that earthquakes was common enough out here on the Pacific coast. They did not wish to own one. Later I tried to give him away, but that failed too. Ladies and gentlemen, I made up my mind that if that auctioneer's brother ever had a funeral at any time that I was in the Nevada Territory, I would postpone all other recreation and be sure to attend it.
Virginia City was the Wild West. Couldn't have been any wilder. They say the first 28 graves that were there were from murders by gunfire. Lots of gunslingers running around. And it was a tough time for entertainers. I mentioned about the fiddlers and the Virginia Reel earlier, but there was also in 1856 in a Marysville Journal talked about any amateur that could torture catgut and horsehair into any consecutively reasonable sounds made more money than the richest mining claim he was in the gambling saloons playing. It was a tough time. And it was also a tough time for other entertainers as well. Mr. Twain had a friend by the name of Artemus Ward. He was an entertainer on the lecture circuit. Reading about him, he was sort of a Red Skelton type of character who quoted Shakespeare occasionally in his show and did some buffoonery and did some intelligent lecturing. And back then you would quote the classics and some of the great writers and Shakespeare. And he was a very witty man. And he came to Virginia City. Mr. Twain was working in the newspaper, and also a fellow newspaper man by the name of Dan DeQuille. And he was also a good writer and a witty fellow, and so the three of them got together. Mr. Ward came for 3 days. He just wanted to do a gig for 3 days in Virginia City. He ended up staying for 3 weeks. And the saloons were open all night, and they had quite a good time. So, and then he was threatening to leave. He said, "Well, I've got to get going." And Mark Twain said, No, why don't you stay a little longer? I'll get you some more gigs, you know." He said, "Rora and Bodie are over here. We could have you go over there and perform." And so he said, "You'll have a good time." And shortly after that, word came back about another entertainer that had been over there. He was a phrenologist, phrenology, or sometimes known as craniology. And it's where you feel a person's head and all the lumps and little dives in your head, and you can tell the kind of character you are. So this guy goes up to a mining camp, one of the roughest mining camps in the West, Aurora. And he's sitting there, and their miners are coming in after a hard day's work, and some of them are kind of grumpy because they haven't found their strike yet. And he's feeling some old fella's head for lumps. And then he starts, I want to get this right, he starts quoting one of the most famous, they say, of all the English poets, Lord Byron. "Maid of Athens, ere we part." He's feeling this guy's head. "Oh, give back my heart, or since that I left my breast, keep it now and take the rest. Hear my vow before I go." Bang! And he gets shot. And Artemus Ward quickly decided, there's no way I'm going to Aurora, so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when I got to Aurora, I expected the prospecting to go easy. You see, I expected to pick the gold up off the top of the ground in large pieces. Yes, nuggets the size of brass doorknobs. I soon came to find out that you had to dig down deep with a miner's pick and a long-handled shovel for the silver and the gold. I didn't have no use for no long-handled shovel. That's because I was born lazy. I'm no lazier now than I was 140 years ago. That's because I reached the limit 140 years ago, and you can't go past possibility. Well, my mining partners and I, we figured we would strike it rich. We would live in sumptuous mansions. We would ride in the finest carriages. We would have every luxury that life requires. That pipe dream didn't quite pan out. You see, we lost our claims and we lost our shirts. We had failed to do the necessary assessment work as required by law, and by law, we had to forfeit them. Those claims came into the possession of a new mining company named the Wide West. The Wide West, soon to become the richest gold and silver mining company in the entire Nevada Territory. After all of that work, I just realized that I had been drunk on the smell of somebody else's cork. I struck a disappointment there. I was a millionaire for 10 days, almost. I was young and undaunted. I decided to try my hand at staking a timber claim. My mining partner, John Kinney, and I, we headed up to Lake Tahoe. We camped out there on the shoreline for a period of 3.5 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, at that time, the waters of Lake Tahoe were so perfectly crystalline pure, you could see to a depth of 65 feet. You could see every boulder, every rock, every pebble, even the grains of sand. Why, it was nearly impossible to go fishing there. That's because the trout could see the line, the hook, the bait, and they knew it was a counterfeit. Oh, the atmosphere up there, ladies and gentlemen, in the mighty high Sierras is salubrious. I do not know what salubrious means. But it is a good and high-sounding word, and I mean no harm by using it. Anyway, the climate up there was healthy. It was so entirely healthy, I believe it could restore an Egyptian mummy to perfect health and vigor. Not one of the ancient ones, of course, one of the fresher ones. Well, we would drift along there in the afternoon, a little ways off the shoreline, that crystalline water, the entire landscape opened completely beneath us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we drifted along, it was as if we were sailing in the sky. One afternoon, I decided to get an early start on cooking supper. I went down to the boat to get supplied up, but before I did that, I started a small campfire along the shoreline. Then I went down to the boat. I was almost supplied up and ready to head back when all of a sudden I hear John yell out, "Sam, Sam, the fire!" I turned just in time to see that a Washoe zephyr, a small wind, had come up off that lake. It was blowing sparks and embers outside the campfire ring into the pine needles and grass and dry leaves. Everywhere they landed, they started fires. Started 20 little fires. I took my jacket off, ran over and tried to put it out, but I couldn't get it. John tried to help me, but all we could do was watch that fire spread. And spread it did into the brush and the small trees. And then it started climbing up the big trees where the wind took a hold of it and blew it from tree to tree until it was a raging forest fire. We watched that fire burn all afternoon. It ran to the top of the ridge, dropped into the next canyon and the ridge beyond. Why, that smoke column was thousands of feet high. Flames were dancing up through it in the unburned gases. And at the very top, an ice cap. And in the middle, lightning bolts striking in every direction. It was a Sierra Nevada firestorm. And before long, and by, it began to snow. Ashes, the size of telegrams. Well, that night, the fire was perfectly reflected in the mirror surface of Lake Tahoe. We collapsed that night and we slept a sleep that does not refresh. You see, if I just had the presence of mind to clear around my campfire for an area of, say, 5 to 10 feet down to bare dirt, if I'd had the common sense to never light a fire under windy conditions, if I'd had a shovel and a pail of water to douse out trouble just in case, and most important of all, if I had never turned my back on that fire and left it unattended for 1 minute, now if I had done all of those things, well, I'd still have my timber ranch today. But as it was, I had to watch my dreams of timber ranching go up in towering flames and thick black smoke. Well, after all, I am only human, although I regret it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I tried my hand at gold mining, timber ranching. I had no show. I was desperate. I had to look for work. I never did like work, even when somebody else does it. Well, as it turns out, I had written a series of 8 letters from Aurora to the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada, under the pen name Josh. Well, the owner and publisher of that newspaper, Mr. Joe Goodman, he had taken a liking to those letters. He offered me a job. It paid $25 a week. $25. I couldn't turn it down. Why, the most well-paid miners on the Comstock were being paid the same salary. My principal duties were to go around to all of the mines on the mighty Comstock and write up as many tall tales as I could invent about their prospects, all for the purpose of selling mining shares to unwary investors over in San Francisco on the Pacific Exchange. It wasn't long before I found I had quite a talent for telling stretchers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a stretcher is somewhere between a lie and the truth. And to properly measure it, you must apply the cat. You see, the principal difference between a lie and a cat is that a cat only has 9 lives. Some jokes are just for family. Well, you know, it is true a stretcher well told can get halfway around the earth before the truth has a chance to put his boots on. I do like the truth sometimes, but not enough to hanker after it. I never let the truth get in the way of telling a good story. No. Now, I always tried to hold myself to a higher standard on the Comstock. That was the principal difference between myself and George Washington. Washington could not tell a lie. I can tell one, I'm just trying not to. You have to be very careful about lying, ladies and gentlemen. Otherwise, you're almost sure to get caught. And you have to have a good memory. And it takes practice and practice and practice. Don't try it unless you're good at it, because he always knows. And one thing I found out, you cannot pray a lie. Well, yes, the Comstock lode. One day, I was writing an article from Carson City, and I decided to sign it Mark Twain. Mark Twain. It suited me just fine. You see, it's an old riverboat term meaning barely safe running and risky water ahead. 2 fathoms, 12 feet, just enough water to float a riverboat on without running aground. Mark Twain. Mark Twain. Music to a riverman's ears. Yes, indeed. It meant you had just enough water. You're running on the edge of danger. That pretty well characterized my entire life. I came to find out that that water was filled with conflict and controversy. I struck up a newsprint argument with another reporter down in Carson City on a competing newspaper. His name was John Laird. I affectionately named him the Liar. He responded to my article with a nice, cordial invitation to a social gunfight on the streets of Virginia with long Colt pistols. Well, after 1 or 2 shots of that Comstock sarsaparilla, I began to think it was a pretty good idea. And after 3 or 4 more shots, I began to think it was a very good idea. And I said to all of my friends there at the Washoe Club, I shall meet the challenge. Tomorrow we will settle our differences as gentlemen. The next morning, I realized that I had changed my mind. After some advice from my friend Steve Gillis and my other friend Dan DeQuill, and some rather strong encouragement from the local sheriff, who reminded me that gunfighting had recently become a felony in the territory of Nevada, I decided to do the most prudent thing a gentleman can do in such a situation. I left Virginia City. Next morning, by overland stage, bound for San Francisco, and Steve came with me.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the hat of the day for minstrel show performers was the top hat. So, changes your whole disposition, doesn't it? After 2 wars with England, Americans were tired of the old music from across the pond. We wanted our own music, and our writers started giving it to us. Probably the biggest sensation of all was the beginning of the minstrel shows in around 1842. And Mark Twain was living as a boy in Hannibal, Missouri. He went to his first minstrel show, and he heard the tune Old Dan Tucker and the Blue Tail Fly and some of those old tunes that we still sing today. Now, of course, we know that the minstrel shows are not politically correct, as a lot of the lampooning that went on, and but we Americans, what we do is eliminate the negative and accentuate the positive. And there was something so wonderful and entertaining about the heartfelt music that was coming from the plantation slaves. And just think of the times, think of the lyrics, it rained all night the day I left, the weather it was dry. As I came down the new cut road, I met Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Toad. Every time that rabbit sang, the old toad cut a pigeon wing. I've been to the east and I've been to the west. I've been down to old Virginia. I spent 40 days in a hornet's nest, but I didn't get stung by any. Just very entertaining. Old Dan Tucker was a fine old man, and a fine old man was he. Washed his face in a frying pan, combed his hair with a wagon wheel, died with a toothache in his heel. And Mr. Twain got to San Francisco, and there were many, many minstrel troops playing. There was Bacchus's Minstrels and the San Francisco Minstrels. I was telling you about how rough it was in those times to play in the mining camps. There's a story about the San Francisco Minstrels had gone up to tour through the mining camps and had gone up to the town of San Andreas. And they were supposed to have a lady with them because the miners, as you know, there weren't very many ladies in the mining camps, so they were starved for even just to look at a woman. And for whatever reason, the lady couldn't make it, so one of the guys put on a wig and they tried to entertain the miners. And the story goes that they were trying to get along, and then you could hear a pin drop in the theater there in San Andreas. And from the back of the room, some old miner said, "Shoot him." It was tough. And I'd like to tell you about a minstrel that you may not have heard of him much, but he was a versifier. He took songs popular from the day. His name was Mart Taylor. He lived in a mining camp up by Grass Valley called Rabbit Creek. And he had a general store there and a little theater in the back of the store, a little saloon. And he also taught dancing. And he was an Italian miner, had changed his name. Mart Taylor doesn't sound Italian, but like so many of them back there. Well, you might not remember him, but you might remember a famous lady who became the Britney Spears of her day, Lotta Crabtree. And she was a young girl. Her mother had moved there, and he taught her some dances. But anyway, I was going to do a song that was popular at the time. Mart Taylor wrote new words to one of our very first important songwriters was Daniel Decatur Emmett. And he's the one that started the very first minstrel show in New York City. They were called the Virginia Minstrels. In 1842, they began performing. They had a banjo player and a fiddle player in the middle. Daniel Decatur Emmett was a fiddle player, and then Billy Nichols, I think, was the banjo player, and I'm not sure the names, but a tambourine player on one side and a fellow dancing jigs and playing the bones on the other side. And you remember some of the tunes even today. Polly Wolly Doodle, Dixie, he wrote Dixie, The Bluetail Fly and Boatman's Dance, and one very famous song was called Jordan Am a Hard Road to Travel. And this song has lasted all these years, and it made its way to the mining camps, but I'll sing some of the original. It goes, Daddy caught a turkey in the woods the other day, put him in the pot to cook him. He jerked up his head and knocked off the lid and gobbled on the other side of Jordan. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves, Jordan am a hard road to travel. Pull off the jacket, boys, roll up your sleeves, Jordan am a hard road to travel, I believe. Well, I've been to the east and I've been to the west, I've been down to old Virginia. I spent 40 days in a hornet's nest, but I didn't get stung by any. Pull off the jacket, boys, roll up your sleeves, Jordan am a hard road to travel. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves, Jordan am a hard road to travel, I believe. So Mart Taylor wrote some new words, said he played up and down the mining camps with thunderous applause, called the California Humbug. This California is a humbug state, out of the world in the bushes, where to meet with a poor man's fate, many a poor devil pushes. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves, mining is a hard kind of labor. Pull off the jacket, boys, roll up your sleeves, mining is a hard kind of labor, I believe. Well, the miner works hard with a shovel and a pick till his body is feeble and tender. He goes to town at the end of the week, he spends his dust on a bender. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves, mining is a hard kind of labor. Pull off the jacket, boys, roll up your sleeves, mining is a hard kind of labor, I believe. Well, the miner lays him sound up. The miner lays himself down to sleep. The fleas all jumping around him, or overgrown bed bugs round him creep, and they all leave him less when they find him. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves. Mining is a hard kind of labor. Pull off the jacket, boys, roll up your sleeves. Mining is a hard kind of labor, I believe. Now this song traveled 100 years later, and one of our very first Grand Ole Opry stars, some might remember a fellow by the name of Uncle Dave Macon, played the banjo. And he used to sing this verse. Well, I may be right and I may be wrong, the autos ruin the country. Let's all go back to the horse and buggy and try to save some money. Pull off your overcoat, roll up your sleeves, Jordan am a hard road to travel. Roll off the jacket, boys, roll up the sleeves. Jordan and my heart road to travel, I believe.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, San Francisco. Why, San Francisco was heaven on the half shell. Yes, it was. Why, the food, the cuisine there was fantastic. Music, minstrelsy, they even had the opera there. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I do not mind going to an opera, just so long as it's performed in pantomime. Oh, yes. Yes, San Francisco. You know, why, the weather there is miserable. Yes. It drizzles all the time. It's foggy. It rains all the time. As I recall, the coldest winter I ever spent in California was that summer down in San Francisco. Yes, indeed. Well, you know, writing on the Comstock was an adventure every day. There was always something to cheer up a newsman's spirit. A murder, a stabbing, a hanging, a robbery, always something to liven up your day and fill you full of joy. But San Francisco was boring. I was writing for the San Francisco Call, and so was Steve Gillis. You all know it now to be the Chronicle. I took upon myself to start writing the police reports. Not long after that, I began to report on the police themselves. Yes. And their mistreatment of the Chinese immigrants. It wasn't long after that, ladies and gentlemen, before I was arrested for disturbing the police. Oh, the San Francisco police at that time, they truly believed that they inhabited the loftiest heights above all creation, above all the other animals, even the jackasses. There were those that held they were equal to the jackass. But I always felt that that insulted the jackasses. You know, you couldn't get much lower, except maybe a book publisher. They're located somewhere between the microbes and the salamanders. Well, it was about that time that I began to develop my opinion of the human race. You know, if you take in a dog and feed him and make him prosperous, he will not bite you. This is the principal difference between a dog and a man. Man is the only animal where a few of his kind are willing to go forth and inflict pain and suffering and harm on others just for the sheer pleasure of it. Oh, but he is the religious animal. He's the only one. He is the only one that's got the true religion. Several of them. He prays and prays for his brother and then cuts his throat if he don't get his theology straight. Man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. Oh, but they're all going to heaven. They're all going. And what a danged heaven it's going to be when you get all them hypocrites assembled up there. Well, sometimes I think that God invented man because he was disappointed in the monkey. You just have to remember, God created man at the end of the week's work when he was tired. To understand it, you have to go back to the very beginning, ladies and gentlemen. Adam. Adam was the author of the original sin. Now, he tried to blame it on Eve, but no, Adam was the author. I just wish that he had taken out an international patent on it. It wasn't entirely his fault. You know, generally when a thing is forbidden, it becomes more popular. Adam did not eat the apple for the apple's sake. No, he ate that apple because it was forbidden. The chief mistake was in not forbidding the serpent, because that way Adam would have eaten the serpent and saved the rest of us a whole lot of trouble. Well, it left me praying for the salvation of the danged human race. Yes, indeed. I wondered how you could improve the condition of a human being. You know, it crossed my mind that if a man could be crossed with a cat, it would improve the man. The only problem is it would deteriorate the cat. It is not that I am a pessimist, ladies and gentlemen. No. I am an optimist who has not yet arrived. Well, everything I have said this evening does not apply to women. To my way of thinking, in my opinion, there is only one good sex. The female one. I ask you, where would the people of this earth be without women? Scarce. Mighty scarce. Well, as I learned in my marriage to my lovely bride, Livy, you have to be careful with relationships. You know, take, for example, the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. You know, familiarity breeds contempt and children. Well, you know, one day, Steve was walking home. He walked by a saloon. Big Jim Casey was in there just beating the tar out of some poor innocent chap. Well, Steve, he always stuck up for the underdog. He went in and said, "Big Jim, just stop." Big Jim said, "All right, I will, but I will finish the job on you." He came running at Steve like a Bramer bull with his head down. Well, Steve, he seen Big Jim a-coming. He reached on over to the bar, grabbed hold of a beer pitcher, and as soon as Big Jim got within range, he slapped him right between the eyes with that pitcher. Big Jim went down, all the way down. Why, Steve almost knocked him from here to fare thee well. Steve and I, we saw it as a matter of self-defense. But do you know that they charged Steve? They charged him with assault with a deadly beer pitcher. Well, I was his only friend, had to go as bail. The only problem was I didn't have no money. So I just used the worthless mining shares I had from Virginia City. They didn't ask. I said nothing more about it. Well, it was beginning to look like Big Jim was not going to pull through. It was beginning to look like he would cross over to the great by and by. Steve and I, we decided to discuss the matter. Upon discussion, we decided to do the most prudent thing two gentlemen can do in such a situation. We skedaddled. He went back to Virginia City, and I went to Jackass Hill, not far from right here. I stayed with Steve's brothers, Jim and William, for 88 days, about 3.5 months. While I was there, we pocket-mined. Well, they pocket-mined. I took notes. I observed. I smoked my pipe. If they found the golden flakes, I shouted encouragement at them. I instructed them to dig down deeper. But as for me, I was after nuggets of a different kind. Local folklore. We found ourselves over, right here in Angel's Camp, at a local tavern, sipping some of that Angel's Camp sarsaparilla. Oh, that Angel's Camp sarsaparilla. Ladies and gentlemen, it was the kind of sarsaparilla that will throw a man for a double back flip, limber him up like a boiled macaroni, all before he can set his glass back down on the bar. I believe it was the seventh wonder of the world, along with the great big trees of Calaveras. Say, I just recalled how I got here this evening. Yes, I rented myself a mule down in Copperopolis. He walked with a limp, but I got him at a discount. I steered him by his ears like a riverboat. He walked as slow as he could. He stopped at every watering trough, every hay barn, and every tavern in Calaveras County. It took so long to get here, ladies and gentlemen, I fell asleep. Well, upon observing that mule's behavior, I concluded that he was a smartass. And ladies and gentlemen, selling you a lame excuse like that for arriving late this evening undoubtedly makes me a wise ass.
In his later years, Mr. Twain made a remark in a correspondence to someone. He said that the only thing this country can furnish that is utterly American was the minstrel shows. That's utterly original. And he came out to the mining camps and enjoyed hearing the music out there. I'd like to go back and play a tune on this banjo. Short banjo, but it's called a banjolin actually, but the banjo was the favorite instrument of the minstrel shows. And in fact, I have a quote. I love to research things. I found this little gem that he said, wrote in 1865 from the San Francisco Dramatic Chronicle. He said, "The glory-beaming banjo, when you want genuine music that will come right home to you like a bad quarter, suffuse your system like strychnine whiskey, go right through you like Brandet's pills, ramify your whole constitution like the measles, and break out on your hide like pin feather pimples on a pickled goose. When you want all this, just smash your piano and invoke the glory-beaming banjo." Well, I hope if you get some pimples, it's the good kind if I play this thing, but it's an old one. I like to sing a song in honor of his riverboat days, and he was a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi, and this is a tune called, it's the only riverboat song that I know of, written by Stephen Foster, another very famous and considered one of our very best minstrel show writers in the 19th century, and it's called the Glendy Burke, and it was a riverboat that had been commissioned, made right around put on the river in 1851 or so. And Stephen Foster, I read an anecdote one time where he wrote this song going down, the only time he took a riverboat cruise down the Mississippi was his wedding after he got married, anniversary, or what do you call that, going out on the honeymoon, yes. And it actually, after he wrote it, it sank a year later. It ran aground near Cairo, Illinois, and then it was an obstruction. It broke apart into several pieces, and it was a dangerous construction to the riverboat pilots, and I'm sure that Mr. Twain knew about it. Oh, the Glendy Burke is a mighty fast boat, mighty fast captain too. He sits all day on the hurricane deck and he keeps his eye on the crew. Well, I can't stay here for the work's too hard, I'm bound to leave this town. So fare thee well, I'll take a little ride when the Glendy Burke comes down. Oh, for Louisiana, bound to leave this town. I'll pack my duds and tote 'em on my back when the Glendy Burke comes down. Well, the Glendy Burke has a funny old crew and they sing the boatman's song. They burn the pitch in the pine knot too to shove the boat along. Well, the smoke goes up and the engine roars and the wheel goes round and round. So fare thee well, I'll take a little ride when the Glendy Burke comes down. Oh, for Louisiana, bound to leave this town. I'll pack my duds and tote 'em on my back when the Glendy Burke comes down. I'll go while I work with the wind and the storm, and I'll go while I work in the rain, till I find myself on the levee docks in New Orleans again. They make me mow in the hayfields here and knock my head with a flail. I'll go while I work with the sugar and the cane and roll the cotton bale. Oh, for Louisiana, bound to leave this town. I'll pack my duds and tote 'em on my back when the Glendy Burke comes down. My lady love is pretty as a pink and I'll meet her on the way. I'll take her back to the sunny old South and there I'll make her stay. So don't you fret, my honey dear, and don't you fret, Miss Brown. I'll take you back in the middle of the week when the Glendy Burke comes down. Oh, for Louisiana, bound to leave this town. I'll pack my duds and tote 'em on my back when the Glendy Burke comes down.
The rain was pouring against the windows. Driving rainstorm. A nice, warm, cheery fire in the old oak stove in the tavern there in Angel's Camp. It was that afternoon, after a day of that infernal pocket mining, we heard old Ben Coon tell the story of a miner named Jim Smiley and his frog. Old Ben told that story that day in this way. There was a fellow here once by the name of Jim Smiley. Seems to me it was the winter of 49, maybe the spring of 50. I don't recollect exactly somehow. Seems to me it was one or the other because the big mining flume weren't built yet when that fellow first come to camp. Anyways, he was the curiousest man about betting on anything that ever turned up you ever see, just so long as he could get somebody else to take the other side. If he couldn't, he would change sides. Any way that suited the other man suited him, just so as he could get a bet. Then he was satisfied. Well, one day, he catched him a frog. He calculated he would educate him. So he didn't do nothing for the next 3.5 months except sat in his backyard and he learnt that frog how to jump. You bet he learnt him good, too. He'd push him from behind. The next minute, that frog would be flying through the air like a donut. Maybe do 1 or 2 somersaults and then come down flat-footed and just right, just like a cat. He practiced them up so constant-like, in a manner of catching flies, he could nail a fly every time, as far as he could see one. Why, Smiley said all the frog ever wanted was an education. Then he could do most anything. And I believe he was right. One day, he said Daniel was the name of that frog, you understand. He set Daniel down on the floor, and then he sings out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." Well, quicker than you can wink your eye, that frog springs up, snakes a fly off the counter, and flops right back down on the floor, just as solid as a gob of mud. Then he goes to scratching the back of his head with his hind leg. Real indifferent like, as if he hadn't no idea he was doing anything more than any other frog might do. You ain't never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, that frog could cover more ground in one straddle than any other animal of his breed you ever see. Why, jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand? And when it comes to that, why, Smiley would ante up money on that frog down to the last red cent in his pocket. He was monstrous proud of that frog. And well he might be. Folks that had traveled everywhere and seen everything, they said that frog throwed over on any other frog they ever see. Well, Smiley, he used to keep that frog in a little lattice box. Now and then, he would fetch him into town and just lay there for a bit. One day, a fella comes into town. A stranger he was. He sees Smiley with that box. What might it be you got in that box right there? Oh, maybe parrot or canary, maybe. But it ain't. It's only just a frog. So it is. What's he good for? Well, says Smiley, I judge he's good enough for one thing. He can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County. I don't see no points about that frog's better than any other frog. Maybe you don't, says Smiley. Maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you had experience, or maybe you ain't only but just an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion and I will wager $40 he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County. Well, the stranger got a mournful look and said, well, I ain't got no frog. I'm just a stranger here. But if I had a frog, I would bet you. That's all right. That is all right, says Smiley. You just take my lattice box here and wait. I will go and get you a brand new fresh jumper. Well, the stranger took the lattice box and sat down to wait, put his $40 down. He sat there a good long while. At last, he commenced to thinking and thinking to himself. He reaches down, he takes Daniel out of that lattice box. Then he reaches back around to his back pocket. He pulls out a miner's poke filled with lead quail shot and a spoon. He pries Daniel's mouth open. He pours in about a half a miner's poke full of lead quail shot, shakes it down his gullet, down to his belly. Why, it filled him up to his chin, almost to his eyeballs. Then he put him back. Well, meanwhile, Smiley had been splashing around out there in the swamp. He catched a frog and he fetches him back to the stranger. Here's your frog. Set him down fair and square with Daniel, his paws next to Daniel's, and I will give the word. 1, 2, 3, jump. Daniel hoisted up hoisted up a little more so, but it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted there on the floor like an anvil. He couldn't no more stir than if he had been a ship anchored out in the harbor. Come on, Daniel, jump, jump. Daniel hoisted up again, a little more so this time. Still weren't no use. He just sat there like a lump of Portland cement. He was as stiff as a carpenter's workbench. Meanwhile, the stranger's flock jumped like a spring off a rock clean out of Calaveras County. And he won that bet. Well, just as he was leaving, the stranger threw his thumb over his shoulder and said, I don't see no points about that. Frog's better than any other frog. And he left. Well, Smiley, he was a good deal surprised and disgusted. He stood there a good long while, scratching his head, looking down at Daniel. At last he says, I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He reaches down, picks Daniel up by the nape of the neck, and blame his cats if Daniel hadn't gained about 5 pounds. He examines him this way, that way, and the other. Daniel belches out a half a miner shovelful of lead quail shot. Well, then Smiley sees how it was. And he was mad. He was the maddest man. He was as mad as if he had been stung by 1,000 hornets. He took out after that stranger, but he never catched him. So there you have it. You go around thinking you're the smartest somebody in town. There's always going to be another somebody who's going to get the jump on you. And that is the story old Ben told us around that stove that night. Well, I worked and worked on that story. I couldn't make it turn out like old Ben Coon told it. One afternoon, I was up there at Jackass Hill. Excuse me, ladies, I had to resort to profanity. Yes, profanity does provide a certain relief denied even to prayer. I wadded the paper up and threw it down. And Jim came up out of the mine shaft there and said, "Sam, what's wrong?" I said, "Jim, I cannot make it come out like old Ben told it. There is not one troy ounce of humor in this story." Well, Jim said, "Now, Sam, pick that paper back up and iron it back out. You finish that story, it will be worth at least 2 shots of whiskey." Well, I was properly inspired at that point. I picked it up and finished the story. Well, I finished that story, and I sent the manuscript off to my friend Artemus Ward in New York. He, in turn, sent it to the Saturday Post. And you know, that story spread across the East like a western wildfire. Yes, indeed. You see, that story was not very funny. No, ladies and gentlemen. But the timing, well, the timing was perfect. You see, you have to understand that story was published in October of 1865. Only months earlier, General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. And days later, well, we lost our president, Abraham Lincoln. Well, the country was in a state of mourning and shock and deep sadness. Then, here comes this story hopping along. Well, I got that story and also many others, truth be known, the old-fashioned way. I stole it. Then I put a copyright on it. The rest, you may say, is American history. Oh, yes. Well, you know, I had to say goodbye to all my friends at Jackass Hill because I took an assignment working for the Sacramento Union, reporting on the Sandwich Islands. You all know them today as Hawaii. Now, the natives of Hawaii had a very curious custom of never wearing any clothes when they were in church. It wasn't long after that I concluded that clothing indeed makes the man. Naked people have little or no influence in society. Well, you know, I guess modesty was born when clothes were invented. One day, as I recall, yes, there was a bevy of Polynesian beauties. They were out in the ocean just off the shoreline bathing. They had left all of their clothing on the shoreline. Well, it worried me tremendously. I went over and sat down on it to protect it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is all that I recall about the Sandwich Islands. Well, after that, I took another trip, the Quaker City tour around the world. And in the year 1869, I published my first book, Innocents Abroad. I met and married my lovely wife, Livy, and started a small family in Buffalo, New York, later in Hartford, Connecticut. Yes, indeed. Oh, yes, I had become a writer. Ladies and gentlemen, I was a writer of the lowest form of literature known to man. It's called humor. Well, after publishing Roughing It in the year 1872, as I recall, yes, and a cascade of others later, including Connecticut Yankee and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, I began to get associated with the famous authors, which made me mighty nervous. Yes, indeed. Shakespeare is dead. So is Chaucer. So are Milton and Spencer. In their days, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not feeling too well myself. Well, you know, all the time I was writing, I was still prospecting, still chasing them get-rich-quick schemes, like that infernal page typesetter. Colossal mechanical failure. Oh, and I lost thousands in the stock market. I learned October is a particularly bad month for investing. So is November, December, January, and so forth. After all so many years trying to get rich quick, I became disappointed. It was taking too long. I asked myself, what is the chief end of man? To become rich? Well, if so, in what way and how? Many would say dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must. I say this: how narrow and unfortunate a thing it is for a man to have money and make a god out of it, instead of making it his servant. Let us invest in each other. Discover, locate, and claim the bonanza within, and share it with another. That's how you will strike it rich in this boom and bust, but all too brief life we live. You see, I began to realize the real mother lode is located within the human heart. That 24-karat affection, shared by friends, loved ones, and celebrated on holidays and the simplest occasions, yielding cherished moments that are never forgotten. Picture this: telling stories around a campfire at Jackass Hill with all my friends. Children laughing, jumping on the bed, first to discover presents under the tree Christmas morning. They declare Santa has been here. These are the memories that make the treasures we keep. These are the riches we take with us. I know this: the frankest, freest, and most valuable product of the human mind and heart is love. I've been thinking about that. Let us endeavor so to live that when we come to die, why, even the undertaker will be sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you in truth how to live your life. All I can do is tell you about mine. And I am a sublime old fool. But then, I am God's fool, and all of His works must be contemplated with respect. I left this earth in the year 1910. Since then, I have learned much about the true meaning of success and riches, about the mother lode of the human heart. Yes, indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, time is growing short. Besides, my feet are getting tired. And you, you are tired. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to stand up and celebrate with us a few of the great songs that we remember in our nation. Please stand. Feel free to clap your hands. We hope that you've enjoyed this evening's adventure way out west in 1861. And let me say this. I am not an American. No. I am the American. And so are you. Well, we're still running on risky water, and now we are homeward bound. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good night. Yeah. Yours truly, night, Mark everybody. Twain. Thank you. Thank you so much.